I was frozen at the company party when my wife chose to dance with her boss instead of me. I stood there, with a glass of whiskey in my hand, trying to smile at my colleagues, but my mouth wouldn't move. The colored lights of the dance floor reflected in her eyes as she smiled at another man as if he were the center of the universe. I approached, touched her shoulder and asked, my voice stuck between my teeth, "What do you mean you'd rather dance with another man than with your husband?" It was at that moment, in that lost look she gave me, that everything made sense. The hesitation, the distance in the last few weeks, the smiles hidden behind her cell phone, the rush to go out alone. It wasn't just a dance. That was the reflection of a secret that I never imagined I would carry on my back. And, even without her saying a word, I knew. Something was happening. I left there with my heart in pieces, like someone who watches the house fall apart in silence while everyone continues to toast around, unaware of the tragedy. On the way home, every memory we had together became a blade. The trips, the birthdays, the notes left on the mirror, everything now seemed like a cruel act. When I got home, she still hadn't come back. And that confirmed everything. I sat in the living room, in the dark, with my eyes fixed on the door. I waited for hours. And when the doorknob finally turned, she came in smiling, with her makeup smeared and her perfume strong. "It was a fun night," she said. I just nodded. The pain was so sharp I couldn't even scream. In the days that followed, she tried to act as if nothing had happened. As if that dance with the boss was just a coincidence. As if there was no tension in her gestures. But I knew. I had already accepted it. There was no marriage there anymore. There was only ruin. That was when I decided I had to move on. In silence, without confrontation, without scandal. Just the coldness of someone who loves and is betrayed at the same time. I started preparing the divorce papers like someone writing a goodbye letter to themselves. I organized everything calmly, left the photos aside, gathered the documents, and sent them to her house without warning. When she opened the envelope, it was as if her world collapsed. She called me 20 times that day. She sent messages, emails, and notes. But it was too late. By the time she realized what she had done, I was already getting back on my feet. He had already cleaned the house, removed all traces of that story from it. I was already starting to smile again. And it was at that moment that something even more unexpected happened. Our daughter, who had always been the bridge between us, found out everything. She found out that her mother had cheated on her father. And the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about her mother faded. "I can't look at her the same way anymore," she told me. She was hurt, disappointed. The woman she had looked up to as an example of love and integrity was now just a stranger who smiled in embarrassment. I told her that she needed to talk to her mother, that she couldn't carry that resentment alone. But deep down, I knew. Something had been broken forever. And it wasn't just the marriage. It was the respect, the admiration, the foundation that supported that family. Meanwhile, I met someone. Someone who showed up unintentionally, without any plans. Someone who knew nothing about my pain, but who looked at me with truth. She listened to me. She made me laugh again. It wasn't about replacing anyone. It was about breathing. It was about feeling that I was still worthy of love. And when my ex-wife saw me with this new woman, her eyes said everything that her mouth didn't have the courage to admit that night at the party. Regret. Loneliness. Loss. She tried to get closer. She said it had been a mistake. That nothing had really happened with the boss. That it was just a need. But I wasn't the same man anymore. I didn't feel angry anymore. I only felt sorry. Because she realized too late the value of what she had destroyed. Still, I encouraged her to reconcile with her daughter. Not for her sake, but for the girl who needed to heal that wound. And it was a tense, heavy reunion, full of silences. The daughter cried. She said she forgave, but that something inside her had changed forever. And the mother, faced with that truth, understood the real weight of her choices. It wasn't just about me. It was about the entire family that she had imploded with a thoughtless gesture. But what no one expected, is what happened next. Something that not even I was prepared to face. Something that turned everything I thought I had overcome upside down. And this revelation, this part of the story, will completely change everything you think about betrayal, forgiveness and starting over. Because sometimes, the worst consequence of betrayal is not losing the one you love, it's losing yourself. And this story, as you'll discover, didn't end when I left the company party. It was just beginning. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but realistically portray the devastating impact that betrayal can have on the lives of those who trust, love and truly give themselves. Our goal is clear: show the consequences, the pain and the deep scars that infidelity leaves. Get ready, because today's story is shocking, intense and unforgettable. Good listening. Jonathan and Isabel met on a late spring afternoon, when everything still seemed new, light and full of promise. He had that serene look of someone who takes the world in stride, a man who listened more than he spoke, and who made pauses the most beautiful part of the conversation. She, on the other hand, was pure energy, spontaneous, engaging, the kind of person who seemed to shine when they entered a room. The difference between the two was obvious, but perhaps that was what made their fit seem so perfect. He was analytical and dedicated to his work as a project manager at a technology company. She was charming and confident in the world of communications, taking care of the marketing side of a large multinational. In a short time, their relationship became a comfortable routine, their conversations turned into long-term plans, and they both understood that they were facing something worth building. They got married 2 years later, in an intimate ceremony full of meaning. Friends said they were an example of partnership. The glances exchanged during speeches, the discreet smiles during dances, and even the little jokes exchanged between one toast and the next showed that there was more than passion there was respect. Over the years, they built a solid life. They bought a cozy apartment, traveled, collected stories. Each object in the house carried a memory: the painting bought in Lisbon, the blanket from the Buenos Aires market, the rug inherited from his grandmother. Isabel had a particular way of making everything feel like home. She was organized, but at the same time she left small touches of her spontaneity scattered throughout every room: a vase of fresh flowers in the kitchen, a scented candle lit even during the week, notes left with loving phrases around the house. Jonathan, on the other hand, was more methodical. He had an almost sacred routine: he would wake up early, drink his coffee in silence, read the news, and go to work. On Saturdays, he liked to go to the market early, personally choose the ingredients for the week, prepare lunch while listening to old songs on vinyl. He didn't make big statements, but he showed his love in the details. He took care of her car, fixed the small defects in the apartment, recorded her favorite shows when she forgot. The love between them was not loud. It was the kind of love that molds itself to the days, the seasons, the habits, and that seemed unshakable from the outside. After 7 years of marriage, their daughter arrived. Sophia arrived as a breath of fresh air into that already well-adjusted routine. She brought sleepless nights, changes in priorities, and an intensity that no one was prepared to feel. Isabel changed. From a vibrant and always willing woman, she also became a mother, caring, protective, and sometimes exhausted. Jonathan, more introspective, also changed. There was a new tenderness in him, a silent admiration for every gesture his wife made toward their daughter. Even on difficult days, when the house felt like a war zone and they were both exhausted, he still found room to smile when he saw her putting the little girl to sleep, humming softly, almost like a prayer. Sophia grew up seeing her parents as a team. At school, she would proudly talk about how her mother was the ideal leader and her father was the solutions man. Parents' meetings were divided, and school presentations always had one of the two, sometimes both, in the audience. The family photos in the frames scattered around the room seemed to immortalize that feeling of togetherness. Annual family trips became a tradition. The trio would go to the coast in the summer, to the countryside in the winter, and it didn't really matter where they went, what mattered was their presence. On social media, Isabel documented everything: picnics in the park, lazy Sundays on the couch, birthdays with simple cakes and real hugs. It was an ordinary life, but full of affection. And perhaps because she was so genuine, she was admired by everyone who observed her from the outside. But routine has a subtle way of taking up space. As the years went by, work became more prominent in Isabel's life. Her position required her to attend events, dinners with clients, and presentations in other cities. Jonathan, always understanding, never imposed barriers. On the contrary, he encouraged, cheered, and accompanied her with pride. He took care of Sophia when she was traveling and balanced the household chores without complaining. But in the silence of her absence, small voids began to form. The complicity that was once spontaneous became scheduled. The meetings that were once moments of celebration became schedule adjustments. The passion did not fade, but it began to share space with practicality. The conversations that were once long and full of laughter were now interrupted by emails and text messages. The lingering glances were replaced by, "I need to resolve this now," and "we'll talk later." Jonathan began to miss something he couldn't name. It wasn't sadness. It was a kind of longing for what they were, even though they were there, under the same roof. He saw Isabel changing before his eyes, more distant, more tired, sometimes impatient. But always present with Sophia. And that was enough for him to keep calm. He didn't want to be an obstacle. He was the kind of man who preferred to support in silence rather than demand presence. He thought it was all just a phase. That they would soon go back to the way they were before. And maybe that was his mistake, loving so much that he always hoped for the best, even when the signs asked him to look more closely. Isabel, on the other hand, felt suffocated by a weight she couldn't explain. The demands of work, her role as a mother, the pressure to maintain the image of a balanced and happy woman at all times. Sometimes, all she wanted was silence. And this desire took her further and further away from the spontaneity that had always defined her. Social media continued to show her a perfect life. But inside her, a storm was brewing. She didn't know if it was fatigue, too much responsibility, or an old restlessness that she had never known how to deal with. Talking to Jonathan seemed difficult. Not because he wasn't listening, but because she herself didn't know what to say. And so, little by little, they drifted apart, still together, but in different directions. Sophia, now a teenager, was sensitive to these changes. She was as observant as her father. She noticed the prolonged silences, the dinners without conversation, the rarer hugs. But like any daughter who loves her parents, she believed that it was all just a phase. She continued to draw hearts with their names, write loving notes, ask for movie nights together. Sophia's love was the silent bridge that still connected them. Jonathan clung to it tightly. He believed that her daughter's love was the reminder that it was still worth trying. Isabel, on the other hand, clung to the idea that everything had to work, even if she was broken inside. And then came the invitation to the company party. One of those formal events that at the same time offered a chance to escape the routine. Isabel invited him, as she did every year. And he accepted, as always. He chose his best outfit, shaved carefully, and applied the perfume she always said she loved. He wanted to be by her side, to show her that they were still together, even after everything. On the way, he thought about how that night could be an opportunity to reconnect. Maybe they would dance like they used to, maybe she would look at him like she used to. But what happened at that party, changed everything. And even though the world kept turning, for Jonathan, time stood still there. And what he saw with his own eyes was the beginning of something he would never have dared to imagine. Now tell me, what would you do if everything you believed in, everything you built with so much care, began to crumble before you, in public, in silence, in front of smiles that no longer belonged to you? That night, everything seemed perfectly normal. Jonathan straightened his shirt cuffs in front of the mirror, calmly ran his hand through his hair, and walked down the stairs with the serenity of someone waiting for a reunion. Isabel was finishing her makeup in her bedroom. She was wearing a long dark blue dress that highlighted her eyes, high-heeled shoes that made her steps more striking, and there was a sweet perfume spreading through the hallways of the house. When he came down, Sophia, lying on the couch with her cell phone, complimented her mother with a lazy smile, and Jonathan silently kept that image. The two of them leaving together, well-dressed, ready for an event where, deep down, he harbored the hope of reliving some spark of the past. On the way to the room where Isabel's company party would be held, the two spoke little. She was frequently on her cell phone, responding to quick messages and smiling from the corner of her eye. Jonathan tried to start a conversation about the city's Christmas decorations, about a trip they could take during the next vacation, but Isabel responded in monosyllables, her eyes always returning to the bright screen of her phone. Still, he preferred not to insist. He was determined to make that night a light moment. Upon arriving, they were greeted cordially by her colleagues, toasts were made, photos were taken, and little by little the music began to fill the room. Jonathan didn't know many people there, but he tried to fit in. He talked to some of the other employees' husbands, praised the organization of the event, and tried some snacks. Isabel, in turn, quickly stepped aside to greet some people. Her smile was easy, her gestures confident. She was at home in that environment, moving naturally, as if she were part of a perfectly functioning machine. He watched her from a distance, admiring and at the same time uncomfortable. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was the realization that she was shining in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. As if she were someone else, as if that confident, outgoing, smiling woman wasn't the same one who shared the silence of the kitchen with him in the morning. It was during a lively song that everything began to shift. Jonathan saw her dancing with a colleague, a tall, well-dressed man with neatly arranged gray hair and an overly confident smile. It wasn't just a regular dance between colleagues. There was an intimacy in their gestures. The glances they exchanged seemed like silent dialogues. Isabel laughed, tossed her hair to the side, and touched the man's arm frequently. Jonathan stood still for a few seconds. He thought he was exaggerating, that he was seeing too much where there was nothing. But something inside him tightened with a strange force. His heart beat faster, not with anger, but with disbelief. He took a deep breath, walked to the dance floor, and stopped in front of the two of them. He touched her shoulder and said, in a low, almost whispered, but pain-filled voice, "What do you mean you'd rather dance with another man than with your husband?" Isabel stood there for a moment. The smile slipped from her face as if it had been ripped away. The man beside her looked away. There was a second of awkward silence before she responded with a flimsy excuse, something about not realizing he wanted to dance, about them just having fun. But Jonathan didn't hear the rest. He just turned and left. The music continued to play behind him, the colored lights continued to pulse, but his world had stopped there. Outside, the night air felt heavier. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just felt the ground give way beneath his feet. Isabel returned home hours later. She entered the house in silence, as if she were walking on broken glass. Jonathan was already in bed, but he wasn't sleeping. He pretended to be sleepy when he heard her footsteps in the hallway. The next morning, she tried to act normal. She talked about the party, commented on the compliments about the buffet, pretended not to notice his silence. But Jonathan's gaze had changed. He no longer asked where she was going, he didn't wait for her for dinner, he no longer started conversations. Their coexistence remained cold, cutting, with the smallest gestures of daily life functioning only as protocol. She seemed relieved, in a way, by his silence. As if a part of her had already expected this to happen. As if she didn't want to deal with questions to which she wouldn't have honest answers. The following days were marked by a noisy absence. They were in the same house, but it was as if they were miles apart. Jonathan started leaving for work earlier and arriving later. Sophia began to notice the tension. She would often ask if everything was okay, if her parents had fought, if she had done something wrong. Isabel would always respond with a forced and hurried, "Everything's fine, honey." Jonathan, on the other hand, couldn't pretend so well. He hugged his daughter tighter than usual, as if he were trying to find shelter from a storm that was growing inside him. Isabel continued to go out to work appointments, always impeccable, always on the move. Jonathan watched from afar, but didn't ask any more questions. One Saturday afternoon, while he was sorting through some old papers in his office drawer, he found a notebook of hers. Curious, he flipped through a few pages. They were lists of tasks, random sentences, notes about meetings. But between one note and another, there were small passages that caught his attention. References to encounters, to feelings, to a constant presence that he didn't recognize. One of these notes said, "Today he made me laugh again. It's strange how light I feel next to him." Jonathan closed the notebook calmly, without rushing, as if sealing something he already knew. Sunday was quiet. In the morning, Isabel went out to take care of some things, and Jonathan stayed with Sophia. They made pancakes, watched an old movie, and talked about school. Late in the afternoon, while the girl was drawing in the living room, he walked to the bedroom, opened the drawer of the nightstand, and took out a folder. Inside were the divorce papers. He had signed them. All that was left was to deliver them. He sat on the edge of the bed, holding the document in his hands, with a strange weight on his chest. It wasn't just sadness. It was a mixture of relief and pain. He didn't know what life would be like from then on, but he knew he couldn't stay where he was anymore. The love that had withstood time couldn't survive the absence of truth. On Monday, Isabel came home and found the folder on the table. She opened it, read it, and for a moment she didn't react. Then she sat down, put her hands on her face, and was silent. There were no tears. There was only the impact of something she thought would never happen. She tried to call him, but he didn't answer. She sent a message, writing only, "Can we talk?" Jonathan read it, but didn't respond. 2 days went by. So she insisted. She waited for him to get home and stood in the living room. When he came in, their eyes met as if they were strangers. She said she needed to talk. He just nodded. The conversation was short. She tried to explain that it hadn't been intentional, that she didn't know how it started, that she felt lost, overwhelmed. He listened to everything in silence, without interruption. And then he simply said, "I understand. And that's why it's over." She cried that night. But she didn't try to stop it. Maybe she knew there was no way to rebuild what had been broken. In the next room, Sophia listened silently, her heart racing and her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The next day, when her parents were in the kitchen, she came in and said in a firm voice, "I want to understand what's happening." Jonathan hesitated. He looked at Isabel. She just lowered her head. Then he gathered up the courage and told her, gently, sincerely, without revealing details. And there, in front of her daughter, Isabel faced the hardest pain, the loss of admiration. Sophia didn't scream or cry. She just stayed silent, swallowing the weight of it all. When she left the kitchen, she didn't speak to her mother again that day. Jonathan went to her room later. He sat down next to her bed. She was lying down, facing the wall. He told her that he loved her, that the pain wasn't her fault, that sometimes adults make mistakes. Sophia listened in silence. Then she said, without looking at him, "I know you're sad. But I am too. And I don't know when I'll be able to look at her the same way." Jonathan held his daughter's hand firmly. And in that gesture, something reconnected. Father and daughter, now united by a pain they should never have shared. But what Isabel didn't know yet, was that what Jonathan had discovered wasn't everything. There was something more. Something that hadn't yet been revealed. Something that, when it came to light, would change everything again. Because the betrayal was just the surface of a secret that no one had imagined. In the days that followed the revelation of his betrayal, Jonathan plunged into a state of silent reconstruction. There was no room for hysteria or dramatic scenes, but for building a new place within himself, a space where he could fit in alone, without the shadow of what he had been. His routine took on a more sober tone, but he was no longer broken. On the contrary, he seemed more present, more whole. He went back to running early in the morning, started going to a new cafe on the way to work and, without great pretensions, started talking to the girl who always served him his cappuccino. Little by little, a new chapter began to form. At home, his relationship with Sophia became even stronger. The two talked more deeply, sharing silences and confidences. She started asking less about her mother and more about life, as if trying to learn from him what it means to carry on when everything falls apart. Isabel, on the other hand, tried to stay on her feet on a terrain that sank with every step. The walls of her home now seemed oppressive to her. The rooms, once filled with warm memories, became reminders of everything she had lost. She tried to occupy herself with work, with events, with impromptu lunches with colleagues, but nothing filled the void of knowing that she had become someone her own daughter could not admire. Sophia's gaze was what hurt the most. There was no shouting, no anger, there was disappointment, the cruelest of distances. It was on a gray afternoon, when the weather seemed to match the weight they were carrying, that Jonathan received a message from Sophia. "Can you come pick me up from school? I want to talk to you before I go home." He left the office with a strange tightness in his chest. When he arrived, she was waiting for him at the gate, sitting with the hood of her sweatshirt covering part of her face. She got into the car in silence and asked to go for a walk before going home. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The low sound of the radio filled the car with a melancholy melody, until Sophia broke the silence with a trembling voice. She said her mother had asked to talk that night, and that she had promised to listen. Jonathan supported her decision, saying that it was important, that even when someone disappoints you, understanding why can be part of the healing. She nodded, but her eyes filled with tears. She said she didn't know if she could forgive, but that she needed to understand, needed to hear from her mother everything she had kept inside. Jonathan parked the car in front of a quiet park and held his daughter's hand. He said that pride isn't what makes us strong, but rather the courage to face what hurts us head-on. That night, when Jonathan arrived home, he saw Isabel sitting in the living room, nervous. Sophia came down from the bedroom with slow steps, carrying a notebook in her hands. They sat down facing each other, while he stood nearby, without intervening. Isabel took a deep breath and apologized again, but this time without resorting to empty excuses. She said she had made a mistake, that she had lost herself at a time when she didn't know how to ask for help. That her loneliness didn't justify what she had done, but it was real. And then, after a long silence, Sophia asked what she hadn't had the courage to ask until then. Was it just once? Isabel lowered her eyes. She didn't answer right away. She murmured no. That it was more than one. And at that moment, her daughter closed her eyes, as if she wanted to erase that response from her body. But with a painful effort, he opened them again and asked her what else she needed to know. Isabel hesitated, took a deep breath, and decided to say everything at once. What he had kept hidden for so long. What not even Jonathan knew. The real secret that made his stomach turn whenever he thought about his daughter. She said that the man she had the affair with was married, and that his wife also found out. But what no one knew, and what she never had the courage to tell, was that this woman was the mother of one of Sophia's classmates. And that, after the story came to light, this girl changed schools because of the shame, the humiliation, the scandal that circulated among the parents of the class. Isabel's betrayal had not only hurt Jonathan, it had affected another family, and more cruelly, it had hurt someone the same age as her daughter. A teenager who found herself in the middle of an earthquake caused by a reckless passion between two adults. Sophia's eyes widened in astonishment. Her face changed as she realized the extent of the damage. She stood up with a tense body, walked to the wall as if she needed support, and stood there, arms crossed and chest heaving. She said she remembered this friend, that she knew she had suddenly disappeared, that her classmates had made mean jokes at the time, but that she never imagined her own mother was behind it. Isabel stood up to try to touch her, but Sophia backed away. And for the first time, her voice was choked with anger. You destroyed someone else's life. A girl who trusted you. A classmate of mine. And you didn't even have the courage to tell me about it before. How did you expect me to forgive you, Mom? Jonathan watched everything without being able to move. It was as if the air in the room was thin. He didn't know that the impact of the betrayal went so far, that it had spanned generations. Isabel tried to justify it by saying that she was ashamed, that she felt like a coward, that she couldn't bear the idea of disappointing them even more. But everything that came out of her mouth now seemed too late. Sophia took the notebook she had brought and left it on the table. It was her diary from the time when everything happened. Pages and pages of thoughts, sentences of venting, hidden pain. She said that there were the days when she cried alone in the school bathroom, without knowing why, just feeling that something was wrong at home. And that now everything made sense. Isabel, devastated, fell onto the couch. She cried silently, as if she were falling apart inside. Jonathan approached his daughter and hugged her tightly, trying to contain her, trying to protect her from the pain of an adult world she had never asked to enter. But Sophia was no longer the same girl. She had grown up in a matter of minutes. She had discovered that sometimes the worst scars are not the ones we see, but the ones that appear when trust is irreversibly broken. That night, after Sophia locked herself in her room, Jonathan stayed in the kitchen with Isabel. They didn't exchange many words. Just what was necessary. She said that she now understood the extent of the damage. That she wasn't looking for forgiveness, but at least wanted to become a better woman. That if she could no longer be a wife and perhaps not even a role model, she at least wanted to be honest. Jonathan replied that belated honesty was like rain that comes after a fire. It can still put out the embers, but it doesn't rebuild what was burned. Isabel went to sleep in the old guest room. Jonathan stayed in the living room, looking out the window, his wine glass untouched by his side. The distant sound of the city echoed as if everything outside was still normal. But inside, a family had been irreparably broken. Not by betrayal alone, but by the absence of truth, by the cowardice of hiding a mistake that grew like a shadow and contaminated what could still have been saved. And even without saying it out loud, everyone there knew, nothing would ever be the same again. But time, with its cruel calm, would still bring more surprises. Because life, even in the ruins, still has unexpected encounters in store. And not everything that breaks needs to be forgotten. Some pieces, when well cared for, can form something new. Something completely different, and perhaps even stronger. The next morning, the silence inside the house seemed even thicker. The sunlight streamed through the windows with a softness that contrasted with the tension hanging in the air. Sophia didn't leave her room. Jonathan, upon waking, walked past her closed door and hesitated to knock. He went straight to the kitchen, where the smell of strong coffee was the only living sound in the house. He sat at the table, his hands spread out on the wooden top, staring into space. Isabel's presence was no longer felt in the room, even though she was there, in the guest room, withdrawn, silent, trying to find within herself some way to keep breathing. What had been said the night before left no room for appeals. Sophia now knew everything. The damage had gone beyond the limits of the marriage and reached the essence of the family, damaging the foundations of trust between mother and daughter in a way that no amount of conversation could immediately fix. Jonathan spent the day focused on his daughter. He prepared a silent breakfast, left it on the table, and went back to his room. After a while, he heard footsteps in the hallway and the low sound of the faucet. Sophia ate alone, washed the dishes, and went back to her room. It was as if he had built a bubble around himself. As the afternoon drew to a close, Jonathan decided that they could not continue like this. He knocked on his daughter's door and she let him in. He sat at the foot of her bed, waited a few seconds, and in a calm voice asked her how she was. She simply replied that she did not know. She said that her body felt heavy, that she could think of nothing but the image of her mother being responsible for another girl's pain. Jonathan did not try to justify or explain. He simply said that he also felt lost, but that they were together. That, somehow, a new path had to be built, even if it had to be with pauses, with stumbles, with space. Later, still on that slow Sunday, Jonathan received an unexpected invitation. A text message from a coworker he had become closer to in recent months. She had learned from mutual friends that he was going through a divorce. The message was simple but direct. If you want to talk, I'm close by. Maybe a coffee will help you breathe better. Jonathan hesitated for a few minutes, but ended up accepting. He left home early in the evening, told Sophia, and promised to return soon. The meeting took place in a small bistro far from the city center, with yellow lights and a welcoming atmosphere. When she saw him enter, she stood up with a discreet smile. She was a serene woman, with the air of someone who had weathered many storms and learned not to let herself be drowned by any of them. They talked for hours. Not about the pain, but about new beginnings. Jonathan felt light. Not because he had forgotten everything, but because, for the first time in a long time, he could talk about himself without having to hide his fractures. Meanwhile, at home, Isabel paced the guest room. She tried to write a letter to her daughter, but she tore each page after the first paragraph. No word seemed enough to convey the depth of the pain she had caused. Finally, she decided to do something different. She took an old box from the back of the closet, filled with objects and mementos from Sophia's childhood. Letters, drawings, notes, hair ribbons, movie tickets. She selected some of these memories and, with trembling hands, put them in a small backpack. She left the room and went to her daughter's door. She left the backpack there, with a note attached to the handle: "When you want to remember who I was to you, before all this, here it is. I will understand if you don't want to open it. But I had to try." After that, she went back to her room and, for the first time, cried herself to sleep. The next day, Sophia saw the backpack. It took her a few minutes to decide to open it. When she saw the drawings, the old notes in her childish handwriting, the little letters written with love by Isabel when they were still inseparable, she felt a tightness in her chest. It wasn't forgiveness. It was memory. And memory has the power to blur pain, to remind us that even those who hurt us were once a source of joy. She put the backpack away, didn't say anything to her mother, but in that silent gesture there was a whisper of a gap, a remote possibility of reconnection. Not immediate, but real. In the following days, the house found a kind of silent equilibrium. Jonathan started seeing his roommate again, this time more frequently. They shared light dinners, deep conversations, and comfortable silences. Sophia noticed this new presence in her father's life and, contrary to what he expected, she showed no resistance. One night, she asked him directly, "Do you like her?" Jonathan said yes, but that it was a feeling that was still being discovered. Sophia just nodded. She said that it was good to see her father smiling again. A short time later, Isabel learned of Jonathan's new presence in her life. Not because he told her, but because she saw her daughter smiling to herself while using her cell phone and asked why. Sophia answered honestly, "I think Dad is meeting someone. He seems happy." Isabel froze for a few seconds. She forced a smile and said that was good. But inside, something she thought she had buried came back to the surface. Regret, now mixed with a bittersweet feeling of definitive loss. She knew then that there was no room for return. That the man she had betrayed, silently despised and replaced with gestures, was now finding a new place in her heart. And that her daughter was by his side. One weekend, Jonathan invited Sophia to travel with him. To a nearby, quiet town where they could spend 2 days away from everything. She accepted enthusiastically. During the trip, they talked about school, movies, the future. And one night, sitting under a starry sky by a lake, Sophia asked, "Do you think Mommy still loves you?" Jonathan took a while to answer. Then he said that maybe she does, but that loving someone isn't enough if you don't know how to take care of your feelings. And that, despite this, he hoped her mother would find a way to be happy too, even if it was alone. Back in the city, Sophia surprised her mother by inviting her to lunch. They went to a small restaurant, just the two of them. The conversation was restrained, but full of meaning. Isabel took the opportunity to say that she was undergoing therapy, that she was trying to understand her choices, and that she wanted to rebuild her relationship with her daughter over time, without pressure. Sophia didn't promise anything. But she didn't get up from the table, or run away. They stayed there for over an hour, talking about trivialities, laughing softly, as if exploring new territory. The final twist came one ordinary evening when Jonathan received a call from an unknown number. On the other end of the line was the wife of Isabel's former lover. She said she needed to talk. That there were things he might not know. They met at a discreet cafe in the city center. She arrived punctually, elegantly, and to the point. She told him that her ex-husband had been involved with other women besides Isabel. That she had found out about this not long after their separation and that, as angry as she had been at Isabel's betrayal, she now understood that they had both been pawns in the game of a manipulative man. But what she wanted to say went deeper. She said that, a year before the affair came to light, he had gotten close to Isabel not by chance, but by strategy. That he had an interest in influencing decisions in her area, and that the meetings that marked the beginning of their relationship were set up to bring them closer together. That, in other words, Isabel had not only cheated on her husband, she had been deceived from the beginning. And that this woman wasn't saying this to ease Isabel's guilt, but so that Jonathan would understand the cycle of destruction this man had caused. Jonathan listened to it all with his eyes fixed, absorbing the full extent of the wickedness of everything that had happened. He thanked her for her honesty, and as he left, he didn't feel angry. He felt a strange peace. A confirmation that he had done the right thing by coming out of that story unstained. That despite all the pain, he had been the only one to preserve his dignity until the end. And now, as he walked down the sidewalk back home, his phone vibrated. It was a message from the new woman in his life. "Thinking of you. How was your day?" He smiled. Because for the first time in a long time, he could answer truthfully, "It was good. Very good." Jonathan left that cafe carrying a new weight, different from all the others. It was no longer pain, no longer anger or frustration, it was a kind of understanding that came with time, with complete truths, with the maturity of someone who survived a hurricane and learned to name the winds that destroyed their home. He walked through the streets slowly, breathing in the fresh night air, as if savoring each step, as if he was finally at peace with the past. The conversation he had had changed the colors of the story in his mind. Isabel was not only the villain of his suffering. She was also a woman led by mistakes, weaknesses, and manipulations that she herself was unable to see in time. Jonathan, however, did not feel that this erased what she had done, but rather gave new meaning to the way he would choose to keep this story inside himself. He arrived home and found Sophia asleep on the couch with a book open on her lap. It was one of those moments he knew would become a memory. The soft light from the lamp, her hair spread out on the pillow, his daughter's serene face, now more woman than girl. He tucked her in carefully, kissed her forehead, and turned off the light. He went through the guest room door, where a crack of light indicated that Isabel was still awake. He thought about knocking, about saying something, but he moved on. Some silences, he had learned, were more respectful than words. And that was the moment to let time do its thing. In the bedroom, he checked his cell phone. There was another message from the woman who had been taking up space in his life, this time more firmly. She said she missed him, that she wanted to see him this weekend, that she was willing to meet Sophia whenever he thought it was appropriate. Jonathan responded calmly, stating that that time was near, that things were settling down, that everything seemed to be falling into place. In the following days, Isabel maintained a reserved attitude. She didn't try to force meetings or long conversations. She took care of the house and dedicated herself to work, but her outlook was more introspective. Sophia was still distant with her, but there was no longer the wall she had before, just a protective fence. One Sunday morning, while they were making coffee together, Sophia mentioned that she had read part of the diary she had written years ago and that she now understood feelings she couldn't name before. She said she had grown up believing her parents were invincible and that when that image shattered, the ground beneath her feet disappeared for a while. Isabel listened with teary eyes. "You didn't try to defend yourself. You just thanked her for sharing that." When Sophia asked her if she had forgiven herself, Isabel was silent for a few seconds and answered honestly that she hadn't completely. That she still woke up in the middle of the night trying to understand what had made her cross so many lines, but that every day she tried to be someone her daughter could, at the very least, respect again. The relationship between the two began to slowly grow closer. There were no spontaneous hugs or loose laughter like before, but there was a mutual attempt to listen to each other, to understand each other. Jonathan watched from afar, without intervening. He knew that there were pains that only mother and daughter could resolve between themselves. He, in turn, was rediscovering what it was like to be loved without suspicion. The new relationship blossomed naturally. They began to go out more often, dinners became breakfasts, and weekends together became the new normal. Jonathan no longer felt divided between the past and the present. Now, he walked with clarity. And although the memories of what he had experienced with Isabel still lived somewhere in him, they no longer hurt as much as before. They became part of his history, but they no longer defined who he was. The day came when he felt it was time to introduce his new partner to Sophia. He chose a neutral, quiet place where they could talk without pressure. Sophia, upon meeting the woman who was now part of her father's life, was receptive, although a little shy. But he noticed something genuine in her, a sweetness that contrasted with the tensions he had experienced in recent months. Over time, they began to spend more time together, going out as a threesome, taking short trips. Sophia never stopped loving her mother, but now she understood that her father deserved to be happy again. And that life is not just about the mistakes of those we love, but also about the courage to move forward even after everything. Isabel, upon realizing this new configuration was taking shape, faced what was perhaps her greatest internal dilemma. Part of her wanted to see Jonathan happy, because she still loved him, even if from a distant place, filled with longing and guilt. But another part felt crushed when she saw that life went on for him with more ease than she had believed possible. Mutual friends, over time, stopped taking sides. They simply observed that the pain for both of them was immense, but that Jonathan's effort to remain dignified and focused on his daughter had touched everyone. Isabel withdrew into herself, avoided events, limited her presence on social media and immersed herself in a deep process of self-knowledge. Her therapist helped her understand that not all mistakes define a person forever, but that some take years for forgiveness, especially one's own, to be possible. One day, at lunch with Sophia, Isabel brought up a subject she had been avoiding for months. He said he knew she was now living with her father's new girlfriend and asked, with some trepidation, how she felt. Sophia said everything was fine. That the woman was nice, that she treated her father with affection, and that, deep down, she just wanted everyone to have peace. Isabel smiled sadly and said that, one day, she would like to meet that person. Sophia nodded, but didn't answer. They changed the subject. But Isabel's gesture was sincere. She didn't want to compete, nor change anything. She just wanted to show that, despite everything, there was maturity in accepting the course of life. That she was still learning, but she no longer ran away from what was difficult. Jonathan, upon hearing the comment, became thoughtful. He no longer felt resentment. And now, more than ever, he saw that his story with Isabel did not have to end in ruins. Even though they were no longer a couple, they would always be Sophia's parents. And for her, for everything they had gone through, perhaps it would be possible to build a respectful relationship, without resentment. In the following months, this relationship began to take shape. It was not quick. It was careful. Dinners on special occasions, exchanging messages about their daughter's school decisions, presents at Sophia's important events. Little by little, something new was born, a civilized relationship, marked by the maturity of someone who understood that the past cannot be changed, but the future can be built with more conscious choices. On a sunny afternoon, during Sophia's graduation, everyone was there. Jonathan, his new partner, Isabel, and her old friends. The ceremony was beautiful and full of emotion. When Sophia went up on stage, her eyes sought out her parents in the audience. She saw Jonathan smiling, holding his girlfriend's hand, and she saw Isabel with tears in her eyes, proud. At that moment, she understood that, despite all the scars, there was still beauty in life's imperfections. That her father had rebuilt a new love without having to erase the old one. That her mother, even though flawed, was still part of her essence. And that, deep down, everyone there was trying to be better, even without knowing exactly how. At the end of the ceremony, they took pictures together. Jonathan and Isabel, next to their daughter, smiling lightly. There was no resentment in their eyes, only acceptance. Later, when looking at the photos, Sophia would write in her diary, "They don't love each other as much as they used to, but they still respect each other." And that, perhaps, is what matters most now. But life, always full of nuances, still had one more movement in store. Something that would come not as a shock, but as a new door that opened. And it all would begin with an unexpected invitation that would change, once again, the course of things. Because when we think that everything has found its place, it is precisely then that life surprises us with something we did not foresee, but that, somehow, was always on our path. In the week after graduation, life finally seemed to settle into a more stable rhythm, as if everyone had somehow found some kind of peace in the midst of what had once been a storm. Jonathan worked lightly, involved in new projects, and their relationship matured with a quiet solidity, unhurried but present. Sophia spent more time away from home, now divided between her new college responsibilities and meeting up with friends. Isabel, for her part, had found a kind of refuge in the volunteer work she had started doing at a women's shelter. It wasn't redemption, and she knew it. But it was an attempt to give something back to the world after having caused so much pain. She felt small in the stories she heard, but strangely closer to herself. It was as if she was finally facing the mirror honestly, seeing her whole image, and not just the pieces she chose to show others. It was one of those afternoons that everything started to move again. Sophia arrived home with a restrained expression. There was something different about the way she entered, dropped her backpack and stood for a few seconds in front of her bedroom door. Jonathan noticed the look of tension on his daughter's face and asked if everything was okay. She hesitated before answering yes, but she couldn't keep her tone. She simply said that she had received an unexpected invitation. Jonathan approached, sat on the couch and asked her to explain. Sophia then revealed that the mother of her former classmate, the one who was directly affected by Isabel's betrayal, had sent her a message via social media. The text was simple, but full of emotion. It said that after so long, she felt she needed to talk. Not with Isabel, but with Sophia. She said that she had spent years stewing in a rage that wouldn't let her live and that now she wanted to listen to the young woman, to know how she felt, maybe even find a way to make peace with the past. Sophia remained silent after telling this, waiting for some reaction from her father. Jonathan took a deep breath, absorbing the weight of it. It was a difficult dilemma. That woman had also suffered, her daughter had been exposed, the family had been torn apart. But it was also true that Sophia was not to blame for anything and that perhaps this conversation would serve to help both sides find some kind of relief. He didn't stop her, but he asked her to be careful, to not feel obligated to do anything. He said that sometimes the wounds of the past didn't need to be touched on again, but if she felt it was important, then she should do it with courage and truth. Sophia thanked him for his support and arranged to meet the following Saturday, at a discreet cafe in a nearly empty gallery in the city. On the day of the meeting, Sophia arrived early. She chose a table in the corner, ordered a chamomile tea and watched the timid movements of the few people who passed by. When the woman arrived, her eyes were a mix of anxiety and tiredness. They sat across from each other and, for a few minutes, they just looked at each other. Then, the woman spoke first. She said that she had thought a lot before looking for her, that she knew that the past was not Sophia's responsibility, but that, even so, she was one of the few people who could truly understand what had happened there. Sophia listened attentively, without interrupting. When she answered, her voice was firm but calm. She said that for a long time she had felt ashamed of something she didn't even understand, that her mother's silence weighed more heavily than any fight, and that it was only recently that she had managed to transform this pain into something that no longer controlled her. The woman was moved. She said that her daughter, now living in another country, still carries the insecurity of those years, but that she was fine. She said she never wanted revenge, but that she felt something had been taken from them, and that hearing from Sophia that she had survived with dignity helped, in some way, to heal a part of that. At the end of the conversation, they both stood up and hugged each other with restrained lightness, as if a part of the past had been left right there, on that table, between cups and words. Sophia went home with her mind in turmoil. When she told her father, he simply hugged her. He didn't say he was proud, but Sophia understood in his silence that that gesture was worth more than any words. Isabel found out about the meeting a few days later, not from her daughter, but from a friend who saw the other woman leaving the café. The news took her by surprise. She hoped that this past would remain dormant, but at the same time she knew she couldn't control how things would turn out. That night, he called Sophia to talk. He asked her directly if she had anything to say about the meeting. Her daughter said yes. She said they had talked, that it was necessary, and that she felt their story was bigger than her mother's mistakes. Isabel listened to everything with her eyes downcast, fighting the urge to justify herself. In the end, she simply said, "Thank you for not denying me. Even after everything." Meanwhile, Jonathan was getting closer to his new partner. They started talking about moving in together. The idea wasn't a youthful fresh start, but a mature decision. They felt ready to share their daily lives, with all their imperfections. Sophia was consulted, of course, and gave her blessing. She said she wanted to see him happy, that she thought it was fair for him to build a new chapter, far from the pains of the past. And when they finally moved into a new house, smaller, cozy, with no ghosts in the walls, Jonathan felt that he had, in fact, closed a cycle. One day, already settled into his new home, Jonathan received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was from Isabel. She began by saying that she did not expect a reply. That she did not even expect him to read it to the end. But she needed to put on paper what she had been keeping for so long. The letter did not ask for forgiveness, nor did it try to win him back. It simply recounted, with brutal sincerity, the moments when she had felt invisible, confused, weak. She spoke of her lover coldly, acknowledging that he had manipulated her, but without placing all the blame on him. She admitted her selfish desires, her wounded pride, her blind vanity. In the end, she said that what hurt her most was not having lost her marriage, but having been reduced to the worst version of herself in front of her own daughter. And that, despite this, she had still learned something, that guilt can be a poison or a teacher, and she chose to learn from it. Jonathan folded the letter and put it in a drawer. He did not reply. But he thought about it for many days afterward. At the same time, Sophia received the news that she had been accepted on a university exchange program. She would be abroad for 6 months, studying at a renowned institution. She was immediately happy, but soon the weight of saying goodbye set in. She gathered her parents for dinner at her house to tell them. The three of them sat at the table as if they were a mature version of what they once were. When Sophia gave the news, they both smiled, applauded, and got emotional. Isabel cried. Jonathan held her hand, in a brief gesture, just to reinforce that, in that moment, the most important thing was their daughter. In the following days, they prepared everything together, documents, bags, goodbyes. And when Sophia left, she left them both a separate letter. To her mother, she said that she was still learning to trust again, but that she would never stop wanting her to be there. To her father, she thanked him for never letting the pain turn him bitter, for being her safe haven, and for having shown her that starting over is possible without losing one's essence. With the house silent, Jonathan returned to the garden in the late afternoons. He planted new flowers with his partner, renovated small corners of the house, and dreamed of traveling. Isabel, for her part, remained at the shelter. Now, in addition to being a volunteer, she was part of an emotional rehabilitation project. He began studying psychology at night. Not for redemption, but because of an almost instinctive need to understand the labyrinths of human beings. He began writing articles, some of which were published. And in one of them, without mentioning names, he spoke about the silent destruction that betrayal causes, about the irreversible impact on children, and about how rebuilding oneself is the hardest part, but also the most necessary. Their lives, in the end, went in different directions. And yet, they constantly crossed paths, because of Sophia, because of the story they lived. There was no more war, just the scars of a battle that everyone survived. And, in the soul of each one, a new understanding. Love can end, trust can crumble, but dignity, when preserved, can be the bridge to a new life, made of better choices, respectful silences and truths that, even if painful, liberate. And at some point along the way, everyone there would understand that it was no longer about forgiveness. It was about keeping on walking. Even with injured feet. Even with a mended heart. Because some stories don't have a perfect ending. But they have new beginnings that honor everything that was learned from the pain. There had been a different silence in the house since Sophia left for her exchange program. A kind of serene emptiness that didn't hurt, but kept her company. Jonathan and his partner, now firmly by his side, had adjusted their routine to the new phase. Gone was the constant presence of their daughter, the long conversations at dinner time, the knowing glances of those who share the same past. Now, time was divided between the solid present and the uncertain but promising future. And, even though homesickness would hit at the most unexpected moments, there was a mature awareness that everything was in the right place. Jonathan no longer looked back as if he were searching for something he had forgotten, but rather as if he were honoring the path he had taken. His new home was small, but it vibrated with the tranquility of a calm love. The woman who now walked by his side did not replace what had been experienced, she illuminated a different, possible path, built without haste, but with sincerity. Isabel, on the other hand, was going through the longest process of all, reconciliation with herself. Although she had accepted the consequences of her actions, the impact of loss and guilt followed her like a silent shadow. She no longer cried every night, but there were still days when her daughter's absence bit at her heart. Her new academic life brought her not only a purpose, but a daily confrontation with her own choices. Studying human behavior, delving into emotional dynamics, understanding the mechanisms of pain and reconstruction, all of this made her revisit her own past with a merciless magnifying glass. But, somehow, this immersion was also healing. She became someone more empathetic, more attentive, less impulsive. The women she helped at the shelter looked at her with respect, not out of pity, but because they saw in her a survivor of her own fall. Isabel never tried to redeem herself through grand gestures. She simply remained present, day after day, in the silent work of getting back on her feet. One day, months after Sophia left, a letter arrived from her daughter. She wrote in detail about her life abroad, about her discoveries, her fears, and even her mistakes. But at the end, there was a paragraph that made Isabel cry for hours. Sophia said that there was still a lot of healing to do between them, but that, little by little, she saw her mother as a whole woman again. That she was in no rush, but that she believed in the process. And that one day, perhaps, they could start over, not as before, but with new truths. Isabel kept the letter inside a blue-covered book, the one she read on nights when loneliness was at its worst. The following week, she wrote back a short letter, saying only that she would be waiting, and that it didn't have to be all over again, it just had to be true. Meanwhile, Jonathan received the news that Sophia had met someone. A classmate, an architecture student, with whom he began to share not only his work, but also his weekends. In the phone call in which he told his father, there was a light laugh, a new sweetness. Jonathan listened attentively and, at the end, said with an emotional voice that all he had ever wanted was for her to know when she was faced with something real. Sophia replied that she had learned that from him. The words reverberated in her mind throughout that night. It was as if every mistake, every loss, every tear had finally made sense. Isabel, at one of the events at the center where she worked, was invited to tell her story. Not the intimate details, but the process of falling and rebuilding. When she went on stage, she was shaking. But when she started to speak, her voice became stronger. She said that she had been the villain in her own story, that she had made choices that hurt more than she imagined, but that everyone has flaws and that what matters is what we do with them afterwards. The audience listened to her in silence. At the end, a woman stood up and said that her speech had saved what courage she had left. Isabel stepped off the stage feeling, for the first time in years, worthy of standing up. Jonathan, for his part, decided to take a new step. He proposed to his partner, not in a grand gesture, but during a sunny breakfast in the backyard where they had planted flowers. She accepted with tears in her eyes. She said he was proof that love can be reborn where no one believes anymore. Sophia was the first to know, and her answer was unexpected. She asked to be the one to walk them down the aisle. On the wedding day, Isabel was present. Sitting in the last row, discreet, serene. When Jonathan's eyes met hers for a brief second, there was a mutual nod. It wasn't forgiveness, it was recognition. They had survived each other. And that was, in itself, a silent miracle. Sophia returned from her exchange program a few weeks later. Now more confident, more of a woman. She was welcomed with a party, but also with an intimate encounter. She and her mother spent a weekend alone in a small house in the countryside. They talked for hours. They laughed, cried, cooked together. On Sunday afternoon, while washing dishes, Sophia said she was willing to try. Isabel, with tears in her eyes, replied that there was nothing more important at that moment in her life. They returned home with lighter hearts. It was not the end of the pain, but it was the beginning of forgiveness. Jonathan continued with his reconfigured life. He continued to be a present father, an honest man, a respected professional. But now he was also a husband again. He loved calmly, maturely, and fully. He had found what many people think they will never feel again, peace within their hearts. Isabel continued on her path of reconstruction, not only for herself, but for the other women she treated. She became a point of reference. She wrote a book about the emotional scars of betrayal, and her lectures began to be sought after by universities. And Sophia, now an adult, became the link that united everything that had been broken, not to restore, but so that each part would have its own place, its own space. This is not a story about revenge, about punished villains or idealized endings. It is a story about consequences. About the wreckage that betrayal leaves, about the bonds that are broken and those that, with effort, can be rescued. Love cannot withstand lies, and trust, once broken, cannot return to the way it was. But it is also true that, from devastated ground, new paths can be born. Paths of truth, of respect, of reconstruction. Now, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments. Do you believe it is possible to rebuild trust after betrayal? Have you ever experienced something similar, or do you know someone who has? If you enjoyed this intense and real narrative, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Stories that touch, that hurt, but that also teach. And remember, here we do not support betrayal in any way. Our goal is to show how it destroys families, dreams, and the most important basis of any relationship, trust. Betrayal hurts not only the person being betrayed, but everyone around them. And there is not always a way to fix it. Sometimes, all there is the chance to learn from the pain. Until the next story.